4. Second Kings chapter 4. And we are looking at the life of Elisha, right? And the many miracles that he performed, a lot of the stories that surround his life. And of course, the Bible tells us later in the New Testament that these things were written for our learning, right? These stories in the Old Testament are in samples to us. Second Kings is what's considered one of the historical books, right? You've got the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and those are the law. And then beginning with Joshua, up through the book of Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, those are considered the historical books. You know, when we look at the historical books and we read them, our goal is what it teaches us in the New Testament, right? It's to learn from them. It's to learn from their examples. It's to find good lessons, whether it be the examples of faith or the examples of character or testimonies to who God is and what God has done. You know, when we read the book of Second Kings, we're not really looking for a lot of doctrine, right? It's not really a doctrinal book. We're not looking in this book for things such as that. It's not really the doctrinal grounding of the church. But these Old Testament historical books that teach us about the life of God's people, the life of the nation of Israel in Old Testament times, there are great lessons that we can learn. Okay, God was working in history. God has ever been working in all of history. And as we read about the lives of his people at different times, there is always something good for us to learn. And hopefully we continue to see that tonight in 2 Kings chapter 4. Last week we discussed the first part of this story. And we were introduced to this woman from Shunem. And she was the Bible says she was a great woman. And there were some things about her and her character that we were able to look at, right? She was a great woman of discernment. You know, she was able, after encountering Elisha and having him in her home, she was able to discern that he was the man of God. He was a prophet of God. He was a faithful servant of God. And her discernment led her to be a servant to him, to help and to serve him. She was a great woman of hospitality, generosity. She not only opened her home, but opened up the books, right, to build, to create and to build this little room, to provide him a bed and a desk and a chair or a stool where he would have a place that he could stay over on his journeys. Great woman. She had a great faith. And we concluded last week's story with verse number 17, where a son was born to her. All right? It had to be the joy of her life. The Bible has already told us that her husband had grown old. Surely any thoughts of having a child, she probably figured were past opportunity. But yet in her contentment, she still was a faithful servant of God. But God blessed, and God gave her a son. In verse 17, it says that the woman conceived and bare a son at the season that Elisha had said unto her, according to the time of life. So here's this woman who didn't ask for it, but just in her faithfulness and in her diligence to be a faithful servant of God, provided for Elisha, took care of him, and Elisha prophesied to her that she would have a son. And that's just had to be a great joy to her. She didn't ask for it. At least she didn't ask Elisha. I would be inclined to think that she had probably asked for a child many times before in her prayers. But she did not do what she was doing in hopes of getting something, and yet God blessed her with a son anyway. Now we come to the next verse, and our lesson tonight is going to start with verse 18. And our first point is about a tragedy. Okay? So number one, let's talk about the tragedy. In verse number 18, it says, when the child was grown, it fell on a day that he went out to his father to the reapers. He said to his father, my head. He said to a lad, carry him to his mother. When he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon. and then died. The Bible doesn't say how old this child was at this point, right? Now, it does give us some indicators. He certainly wasn't an infant, so at least some years have passed, or at least a little bit of time has passed. He's not an infant because he's wandered out to his father among those that are reaping in the fields. And yet he wasn't too grown up because, we read about how another lad could carry him back into the house. He was still small enough to hang out there on his mother's knees or on her lap. So somewhere in that young, toddler, maybe just over a toddler range, young child, right? It hasn't been too long since Elisha prophesied of this child. This child has been born. This child's not much older. And he's out with his father in the field. And it's early in the morning. It hasn't even reached noon yet. And he fell sick of some kind. And his head started to hurt. And he looks at his father and he says, my head. Now, what it looks like is that the dad didn't necessarily take it too seriously. It looks like maybe the dad didn't think anything of it because dad didn't stop what he was doing. The father just grabbed another boy that was out in the field and said, take him on into mama, right? It says there in verse number 19, carry him to his mother. So, hey, I've got a headache. Dad, my head's hurting. The dad didn't necessarily maybe take it too seriously. Maybe he didn't think that there was anything to this. And he sends him back on into the house. Dad stayed out in the field. The child was taken into the house. It says that he sat on his mom's knees till around noontime. And then we're told that the child died. It was more serious than Dad thought, wasn't it? The child eventually died while sitting on his mother's lap. That's a tragedy, isn't it? That's a sad story, especially with how good last week's story ended, right? Here's this woman has been faithful, and the Lord has blessed her with a child that she never thought she'd be able to have. And yet we don't get very much into the next passage, and we find that child is gone. That child has died. That is a tragedy. And listen, preachers preach often about how important it is for us to consider life, consider its importance, to take it seriously, and to take the message of God's word seriously, right? You ever hear preachers preach and they preach about salvation or they preach about trusting the Lord Jesus Christ and they tell you not to wait? They tell you that today's the day of salvation, now is the accepted time, now is the day of salvation, the Bible says. And they tell you how important it is to trust the Lord Jesus Christ and to not wait around and to not, don't mess with life because you never know what'll happen. You never know what could happen from one day to the next. You're never guaranteed another opportunity. You're never guaranteed another day. Listen, this story shows us just how true that is. Whether old, young, sometimes you get more notice than others. Sometimes people fall sick with an illness and they can see it coming down the tracks, right? They know that they don't have much longer for this world. And then there's a scenario maybe like this kid where this came out of nowhere, right? His head started hurting one day when he's out in the field with his father, and by lunchtime he's gone. And that's a tragedy. And the story opens very, very sadly to think about. Now, number two, let's talk about the mother's response. Now, she's a great woman, the Bible's already told us. And this tragedy is going to be a great test of faith. Do you remember what she said in verse 16? Look back at verse 16. He said, about this season, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. And she said, nay, my Lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thy handmaid. When Elisha told her that she was going to have a child, she's like, you better not be kidding. You better not be lying. This is like the joy of her life, right? She didn't have any kids. Her husband was old. She assumed that those days were past. She's now spending her time, trying to take care of the man of God, provide for him, provide a room for him. And she's told, you're going to have a son. And she's like, oh, you better not be kidding. That's wonderful news. That's great news. And now that son was taken away. That would be a real test of your faith, wouldn't it? That'd be a real challenge to your faith. You know, this woman is different than some of the other childless mothers in the Bible. You know, we read about Sarah, and we read about the actions that she took so that Abraham could have a child. We read about Rachel and how in great grief she cried out to her husband, give me children or else I die, right? And then we read about Hannah who prayed, and she prayed earnestly, and she prayed to the degree that, Lord, if you just give me a son, just let me have a son, I'll give him back to you. I'll give him back to your service all the days of his life. This woman's different. It doesn't mention those things about her. Now, obviously, I would assume, and I'm sure that she prayed for the Lord to give her children. I'm sure that there was a time when she and her husband were younger that was probably a great desire of her heart, and she probably prayed to that end. But we don't see that mentioned, right? Those things aren't told us. The Bible doesn't go into those details. She seems to have, at least by this point in her life, been giving the understanding that this isn't going to happen. My husband is old. And so she has now devoted her life to a great life of giving, being a blessing to the man of God. Even more the test of her faith, right? Here is a child that was gifted to her beyond her expectation. And now he's gone. You know, and there's just not really a lot of way to make heads or tails of that, right? Because later when she meets the prophet, in a later verse when she meets the prophet, she says, did I desire a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? That's what she says later when she meets Elisha. It's got to, you got to wonder, did it pass through her mind? You think, why is the Lord doing this? I didn't even ask for this son. I didn't do what I did to get a son. This was a great gift, and now it's gone. It would be hard to try and understand what's the Lord doing. Why would he give me a son just to take him away? Now, she doesn't respond that way, but you could certainly imagine how it's possible that we would potentially respond that way. It's a great trial of faith, isn't it? So let me stop right here and say this. This chapter has shown us two different women in two completely different sets of circumstances, right? The first woman, her husband dies. They're dead broke. She has children, but are worried they're going to be taken into slavery. This woman and her husband's alive. They don't seem to be hard up for money. Doesn't have a child. Has one given, and then legit has one taken away. You got two different women presented to us in chapter 4, totally different circumstances, total different walks of life, total different spots in their lives. But both were prone to a test of their faith, right? Both were challenged in their faith. The Bible teaches us that faith grows through trial. Faith does not grow when things are easy, right? When things are easy, when there's nothing going wrong, and when there's no hard time or when there's no trial, faith itself doesn't really grow, right? When times are easy, we often take things for granted. It's when our faith is tried that we grow as Christians, right? That's when we become more like Christ. That's when we learn to rely on him, where our trust in God is increased. As we go through trial and as our faith is put to the test, we find God faithful, we find God able, and that's how we grow, and we grow as Christians. Now, faith doesn't always grow. Faith doesn't grow when times are smooth and things are always easy. The flesh enjoys those times, right? The flesh likes it when things are easy. And even in the faith, there are times of respite. I mean, life's not just one continual trial of faith, and for that we're thankful, right? We're glad that there's not always a trial of faith. There are breaks. There are times when things are good. There are some times when things are pretty smooth. But the Bible does teach us that our growth is often spurred by trial. In our trial, we learn to trust God. Our patience is strengthened. And according to James chapter 1, patience is supposed to have a perfecting work. You read that verse and it says, let patience have her perfect work. And what that means is that's perfecting or a maturing work. When trial comes, your patience, let patience have her perfecting work. As we patiently endure the trials of life and the trials of our faith, we grow. It makes us more mature believers. It makes us more mature Christians. That is the intent behind trials, okay? God doesn't give his children trials to destroy them. God doesn't give you trials or put things in your path like that to ruin your life. But he does try his children to perfect them, to mature them. You think about these two women, right? Listen, there's nobody that's above having hard times and having trials of their faith. People with money, the lady that has money, she's still prone to trials just like the woman that was broke. The woman that had a husband is prone to trials just like the woman whose husband had died. The woman with two boys, two grown boys, she's just as prone to trials of her faith as the woman that's just lost her son. Listen, you will never be able to look at this life and say, if I just had this in life, I wouldn't have any trials. If I just had this, life would be easier. Because there is always somebody that has that life, and you know what they have? They have hard times. They have trials, okay? There is no set scenario in this life where you're going to have everything all nice and easy and figured out, right? We often use this analogy as we talk about money, right? And I think sometimes we use money as the example because that seems to be what everybody is convinced would fix all the problems, right? I'd be more happy if I had a lot of money, right? Because if I had money, I could buy whatever I want. I could do whatever I would want to do. And yet, you know what we find amongst a lot of rich people? They're just as miserable as poor people. And they have trials of their faith. And they have hard times. And they have struggles. Don't ever make the mistake of thinking, well, if I just had this, or if I could just be this person, life would be so much easier. Okay? That's not true. And we're presented two women here in this passage that they're in different spots in life right now, but both are prone and both going through a great, great trial of their faith. All right, now let's hasten through this. Considering this great trial, I think we're able to see that this woman had a great faith. The Bible already tells us that this is a great woman, but I think that there's some markers along this path that show us that. Let's begin, verse 21. So her son has died. Verse 21 says, she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door upon him and went out. Took him, laid him up on the bed of Elisha, the bed that she had made and the room that she had made for Elisha. I think it's interesting. Almost all of the commentators that I was reading this week pointed out the same thing. That she took him into Elisha's room and put him on Elisha's bed and left. She did nothing that would actually prepare him to what? To be buried. She did nothing to his body to prepare it to be buried. We know in the Bible they did those kind of things. It's just keep that in your mind, right? It's like she didn't even think about that. She didn't consider that. Takes him, puts him in the room, and she goes out. Verse 22, she called to her husband and said, send me, I pray thee, one of the young men and one of the asses, that I may run to the man of God and come again. She's going to go see Elisha. And he said, wherefore wilt thou go to him today? It's neither new moon nor Sabbath. She said, it shall be well. She went out into the field, and she didn't even tell her husband what had happened. I would imagine, okay, because I know Mandy, and I'm going to assume the same thing about your all's mom, Ty, here, that if something happens to one of you guys, if something happens to one of our kids, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be about the first one that Mandy calls. She may have to call 911 first, right? But I will be top of the list when she gets around to letting people know of something bad that happens. Same thing with your all's mom, right? She's going to call John right away. This woman didn't tell her husband. In fact, when he says, what in the world is going on? She says, that's all right. It shall be well, right? Verse 23, she says, it shall be well. He doesn't even know what's going on. All he knows is he's out in the field, and she comes out, hey, I'm going to grab one of the guys and one of the donkeys, and I'm going to go see the man of God. And he's having trouble processing it, right? He's like, it's not new moon. It's not Sabbath. It's not one of these holy days or one of these festivals where you would maybe traditionally go to a certain place or go to the prophet to hear God's word. Or, don't people look at you crazy, right? If you're going to church and it's special services, you're going to church on a Tuesday. They have trouble registering that. And this guy, he can't even register. Why is she going to see Elisha? It's not new moon. It's not a Sabbath. She's like, don't worry about it. Right? Verse 23, it shall be well. Don't worry. Everything's fine. Everything's not fine. Right? There is a son that is laying in the house up on a bed, and he died. And she tells her husband, everything's fine. Right? It shall be well. No worry. All right, verse 24. Then she saddled an ass and said to her servant, drive, go forward, slack not thy riding for me, except I bid thee. She jumps on the donkey with the rider, and she tells him, you go, and you go as fast as you can. And listen, don't hold up on my case. Don't think, oh, I've got this nice, dainty woman here riding with me. I better go slow so she doesn't fall off. No, you ride hard. You don't let up unless I say let up. Verse number 25. She went, she came unto the man of God to Mount Carmel, and it came to pass when the man of God saw her afar off, he said to Gehazi his servant, behold, yonder is that Shunammite. Run now, I pray thee, to meet her, and say unto her, is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child? And she answered, it is well. Now I want you to imagine the picture there that Elisha sees her from a distance. He's like, oh, I know who that is. That's that woman. I stay in their house all the time. Tells his servant Gehazi, hey, go down. Go see what's the matter. Ask her if everything's okay. Ask her, about her husband, about her child. And when Gehazi goes, you can imagine that Gehazi's down there trying to get her and trying to stop him, trying to ask how things are going. She just rides right past. Yep, everything's fine. You get the picture, Hey, go ask her how things are going. And she just rides right on by because you know what? She's not stopping. She wants to go see Elisha. So she just rides past. Yep, everything's fine. Does this woman not realize she has a tragedy on her hands? Is she just going to tell everybody in the world it's all good, everything's fine? Tells her husband everything's fine. Tells Gehazi, yep, everything's fine, it's all well. All right, how about verse 27? When she came to the man of God, to the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to thrust her away, and the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is vexed within her, and the Lord hath hid it from me, and hath not told me. Elisha can tell that there's something wrong. Her soul is vexed within her. And then she said, did I desire a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? What's interesting there is that she doesn't necessarily spell it out for Elisha. All she says is, do you remember what I said when you told me I'd have a son? And I told you, you better not be kidding. And immediately Elisha knew. God had not revealed this to Elisha ahead of time. Now, the Bible tells us that oftentimes the Lord would do so. In fact, in the book of Amos, chapter 3, verse 7, it says specifically of how the Lord would often reveal things unto his prophets. But Elisha was a little bit puzzled when she comes and she falls down at his feet, and he can sense it. He understands, like, there's something going on here, but the Lord didn't tell me. The Lord has not shown me this. This is the first time, when he really gets to grasp that there's a problem. And when she brings up her son, he immediately knows. Because before she can even finish, before she says anything else, look at verse 29. Then he said to Gehazi, gird up thy loins, take my staff in thy hand, go thy way. If thou meet any man, salute him not. And if any salute thee, answer him not again, and lay my staff upon the face of the child. Immediately, she says, you remember what I told you about my son? And Elisha doesn't even need to hear anymore. He says to Gehazi, go. You go, and you get to her son. And you don't stop. And if somebody salutes you, you don't take time to stop and salute them. You just go. You get there, and you take my staff, and you lay it upon that child, right? Verse 29. Take that staff and lay my staff upon the face of the child. So it seems like Elisha has a plan, right? Well, look at verse 30. As the mother of the child said, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. You know, when she came to Elisha, Elisha sends Gehazi with the staff to go forward. And you know what she says? I'm not leaving until you come. I'm not leaving. I came to see you. I didn't stop to see Gehazi on the road. And I'm not going anywhere until you come. Now, this is interesting language. Let me read this to you again. Verse 30. As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. You know why that's interesting? Have we heard those words before? Look back real quick at chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 2. Elijah said to Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. And Elisha said unto him, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. This is the same thing that Elisha told Elijah once before, right? Elijah said, listen, I'm going to go over here, and I need you to stay here. And when we talked about this in chapter 2, what do those words mean? You knew at that point how serious Elisha was, right? He was going to follow Elijah. He knew that Elijah was where the power of God rested. He was the man of God. He was not to be let go. He was going to stick with him no matter what. Interesting, these are the exact same words that this woman uses. He's going to send Gehazi on with his staff. Nope. As the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. She knew he was the man of God. He was the man in Israel where the power of God rested, and she was not going to leave without him. This woman has a very, very, very great faith. This is a woman that every step along the way has felt like she could tell her husband, it'll be all right. Everything be fine. She could tell Gehazi, all is well. It's well. She knows she had to get to Elisha because Elisha's the man of God. Elisha has the power of God. And if she could get to him, it'll be okay. Well, in verse number 31, verse 30, it says that he arose and followed her. He was impressed by her faith. And he was going to send Gehazi on up ahead, but he was going to come now. He was going to come too. So verse 31, Gehazi passed on before them, and he laid the staff upon the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Wherefore he went in again to meet him and told him, saying, the child's not awaked. That's different language than saying the child is dead. When Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead, and laid upon his bed. He went in therefore, and shut the door upon them, and prayed unto the Lord. Number 3, lastly, let's talk about the miracle. It says in verse 33 that he prayed unto the Lord. And he went up, and lay upon the child, and put his mouth upon his mouth, his eyes upon his eyes, and his hands upon his hands. And he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Then he returned and walked into the house, to and fro. He went up, stretched himself upon him, And the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her, and when she was come in unto him, he said, take up thy son. Then she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground and took up her son and went out. This is a great miracle, right? This woman, who has exemplified great, great faith so far, would not let Elisha go and would not go back home until she convinced him, nope, I'm not going without you. Okay? Well, I'm going to send Gehazi with my staff ahead. Nope, that's not going to work. As thy soul live, as the Lord liveth, as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. Elisha comes to the home. He finds the situation. Gehazi reports about what's going on upstairs, and he goes in. Now turn to 1 Kings chapter 17. Because just like the woman and her words to Elisha were memorable because we've seen them before, we've seen this event before as well. Because what Elisha does is similar to what Elijah had done in a previous episode. 1 Kings 17, in verse 17, it says, it came to pass after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick. And his sickness was so sore that there was no breath left in him. She said unto Elijah, what have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son? And he said unto her, give me thy son. And he took him out of her bosom. She carried him up into a loft where he abode and laid upon his own bed. And he cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn by slaying her son? And he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come in unto him again. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child and brought him down out of the chamber into the house and delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, see, thy son liveth. We've seen this before, right? Elijah had done something very, very similar in the raising of another widow's son. Now, this lady's not a widow, but she needs the same help. And Elisha goes into the room and he stretches himself over this child, warms him up, goes out for a little bit, comes back in, puts him, stretches over him again, and the child sneezes 7 times, and he wakes up. Now, I'm sure A.W. Pink probably has a significance to the 7 times and what all that means. I don't know what all the 7 sneezes represents, but I know that this child's awake now. This child's alive. And that's the end of the story, right? This woman, in her great, great faith, was able to have her son revived again. Now listen, you and I, and I'm not going to say that it would be a lack of faith to do so. You and I would have had a very, very hard time responding, though, in a similar way, right? There's something about this woman that it's almost like she knew that this was possible. It's almost like she had faith to know that God did not give me this child just to immediately take him away. All right? And I said that to the prophet. And so when this child dies on her lap, I cannot imagine a mother being so calm as to take him and lay him down in a bed, shut the door behind him or behind her, go out into the field to talk to her husband, not mention anything about it, borrow a donkey and take a rider and go find the man of God. Along the way, even tell Gehazi, it's okay. Everything's fine. It's all well. It's almost as though this woman knew that Elisha was able and would be able to do this. That is a great, great faith. In the book of Hebrews chapter 11, We all know what this chapter is about, right? Faith, isn't it? Hebrews chapter 11, it goes through names and names and names of people and their faithful exploits, the things that they did by faith. Now, there's an event that's mentioned here, but there's no name attached to it. But in Hebrews 11, and in verse 33, it says, who through faith they subdued kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions. That I think we have a good idea about who that might be talking about, right? Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. And it doesn't say, by the way, reference 2 Kings chapter 4. But you and I both know that this was likely in the mind of the writer of Hebrews. As he could recall these stories from the Old Testament and he could write about their faith, 2 Kings chapter 4 doesn't give us her name to mention or to write down when you get to the book of Hebrews. But it is a very prominent story of faith. And this writer, amongst all of the heroes of faith, could write, women by faith received their dead raised to life again. There is I can't put it into terms, the faith that this woman had. There's no way to explain the way she responded to her son dying than to say, it's like she knew. It's like she had a great faith that all would be well. And her faith was such, and she believed so much that it would be well, that even when it wasn't well, she was saying it is well. Okay? That is a faith that I hope someday is cultivated within me, within all of us, right? Not to say it is well when you're holding the child after he's revived, but to be able to say it is well during the trial. This woman had that part figured out. See, I struggle with that. I don't struggle with giving God the glory and praise when everything works out fine, right? We're thankful, we're a grateful people. On the other side of a trial, it's easy to look and say, yep, Romans 8:28 was correct, right? It did work out for good. To God be the glory, God be praised, all is well. I don't seem to have very much trouble saying that after a trial. This woman was saying that kind of stuff in her trial. What a great testimony of faith, right? So that's our lesson for tonight. Keep those things in mind. Just a great example of faith. Okay? And no matter what, chapter 4 gives us the story of two different women, two different walks of life, two different stations, two different incomes, two different families. We're all prone to trials of our faith. We're all prone. We will all endure trials in life. This woman, her faith was such that she just walked around saying it as well. When anybody else that would have been in that situation, very likely could have responded different. What a great faith. All right. All right. Appreciate your attendance. Why don't we all stand together and we'll have a song this evening.